That is going to lead to a half cadence back in the key of D major, and you've got a couple of 3 beats of rest, which gives a dramatic effect. And then what you're going to hear in the 4th phrase is that it brings back the first 2 measures of the first phrase. So you hear that return. But then it brings back the last 2 measures of the 2nd phrase. Although now this will be in tonic rather than the dominant key that you previously heard it in. So this is one of those where it combines in the return the, one element of the first phrase and another element of the 2nd phrase. Okay, so let's listen to the 2nd half. So that is the theme of that last movement, Incipient Three-Part Song Form. All right, so be sure that you can define that, and yeah, I'll definitely have that on this next test. All right, the next 2 are very similar, Three-Part Song Form and Enlarged Three-Part Song Form. So they both have a 3rd part that brings back part 1 material. So they are ternary patterns. And that return will be the opening material coming back. It can be changed a little bit, but you'll expect it to come back in the original key, in the home key. And that you definitely will hear that connection between the opening part. Now, the main difference between these is that in Enlarged Three-Part Song Form, if you have the use of auxiliary members, or if you have the repetition of any of the parts, then you're going to call it Enlarged Three-Part Song Form. So, really, just a regular 3-part song form is relatively rare. It's usually you're going to have some kind of repetition involved. But let's look at the example. So if you go back to the examples of song form, let me find that here real quick. Then you'll see that this next one that I'm going to show you, I have numbered as number 8. It says Allegretto Scherzando, and this is Beethoven's teacher in Bonn, who's the composer. You see that you have an opening section that is 2 phrases in length, and the 2nd phrase, which is marked piano, is a repetition of the opening, so it's parallel in construction. So you have A and then A prime, and it is just the last measure that's different. So they're very parallel in construction. And then after those double bars, you then see the part 2. Part 2 is only a single phrase in length, so it's not as long as part 1. So remember, these parts can be as short as a single phrase. It is contrasting. And you see you have, in this part 2, you have two measure semiphrases, which are parallel in construction. And so the 3rd and 4th measures are a sequence of the 1st and 2nd measures of that 3rd phrase. And then where it says piano there in the 3rd system, that brings back the 1st part, and it brings it back exactly. And so that's an example of a three-part song form. So you don't have any auxiliary members, you don't have the repetition of sections. And like I said, that's in general, you don't find that as often, but that's the situation with three-part song form. All right, number 9 now is an example of enlarged three-part song form. And so this is from the Scenes from Childhood of Robert Schumann. And this particular movement is called At the Fireside. And this is in F major. It's a short piece. And you see you have double bars there at in kind of the middle of the second system. So what we're going to hear is a 4-measure phrase, and then a second 4-measure phrase that's parallel in construction. The opening note is repeated, but then it goes up, and so it's very similar, but it cadences, in a very similar way. This cadence is an authentic cadence, imperfect authentic cadence, at the end of the first 2 phrases. So let's listen to that much. Let's see, that video is not available right now. So we're going to just look at this and listen to it later. What happens in the second part, which is where you have the double bars and repeats, is that this is shifting keys, and the material is very similar. That's one thing about these song forms. You don't really have a lot of contrasting, moods. It will just shift to different keys, but a lot of times the thematic material can be very similar. But one general rule of thumb that I want to mention now is so this is, rule of thumb number 2. So as I mentioned, generally with phrases, I said that if you're looking at 4-measure phrase lengths, then you can't have a 2-measure phrase. You're going to look at that as a semiphrase, which is an extension. So you can't see that 2-measure semiphrase as its own phrase, okay? But this rule of thumb has to do with the use of double bars in song form analysis. So double bars indicate the end of a section. So in song form analysis, and just in general, in compound forms as well. So here in this Schumann example, we see at the double bars, then that would indicate that's the end of part 1, and beginning of part 2 is just right after. So it starts with an upbeat. You see how the phrasing goes there, and the opening part begins with an upbeat as well. So part 2 starts with the upbeat just before the double bars. And that first phrase then cadences on G minor, and then you have that sequenced down, and this is going to cadence on A minor, but then you have another step down so that another measure that takes you to the a tempo, where you have then a return part 1. So you have a 5-measure phrase there for that second phrase of part 2. And this is an example of an elided cadence, actually, because the downbeat right there where it says a tempo is the cadence chord of the end of part 2. And that also is sharing the beginning of the return of the opening part. So at the alt tempo, then you have part 3, but you have that cadence chord that's elided there. So that's an example of an elided cadence. One thing I'll mention, with these YouTube videos, they can suddenly, not be available. And so let me know if a YouTube link is no longer working. And, shoot me an email and let me know that so that I can get it fixed and find another example for you, because that'll happen from time to time. All right, so this part 2 is a parallel period as well. So part 3 then begins at the alt tempo, and it's an octave lower for the first measure of it. If you compare that to the beginning, you see how that's an octave lower. But then on the second measure, it jumps back up and goes back to the original register and brings back that whole first phrase. And then it is similar to the beginning of the second phrase, but now it has a different cadence. And you have a 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1 cadence at the end of part 3, and then you have a repeat of that. So in this particular example, you have a parallel period for part 1, parallel period for part 2, a parallel period for part 3, and then parts 2 and 3 are repeated. So because they are repeated, then you're going to call that an enlarged three-part song form. And then this particular example has a codetta at the end, which is 2 4-measure phrases. And so that little codetta, even if it didn't have the repetition of parts 2 and 3, because it would have a codetta, that would also qualify for being called an enlarged three-part song form. So that is an example. And then the final example that we're going to look at, and then I'll give you a little assignment to do, is the last one here, number 10, which is one of the Brahms Opus 39 waltzes. They were originally written for piano duet, and then he made a solo piano version, which is what this is. And this is an example of enlarged three-part song form, and this is one in which, instead of having a repeat sign that's being used to repeat parts 2 and 3, he has a literal written out repeat of part 2, and then when that part 3 comes back on a repetition, it's embellished. So look at that real quickly. The first part is the first 8 measures. And it's a parallel period. You see at the first ending that it cadences on C minor. So it shifted from A flat major, which is the overall key, to the key of C minor. So let's see if we can get this one to play. Second phrase, cadences on C minor. That's repeated now, so this is repetition of part 1. So what happened was that you have 6 measures for part 2. He takes the first semiphrase and then he sequences that up. And so that's the extension right there. And then he has the final 2 measures that give you a half cadence. And so that happens there at measure 14. And I stopped it right there at measure 15, which is the return of the first measure, the return of part 1. So that would be part 3. All right, let's keep going. So that's measure 15. So this is return part 3. Okay, now here's what happens here. Okay, so what happened right there was that instead of it modulating and cadencing in C minor, then he rewrites it so that it has an authentic cadence in tonic, in A flat major. So part 3 doesn't have to be exactly like part 1. It just has to bring back the opening material and be, clearly a return of part 1 material in the same key, but then it can be changed like, we just heard. Okay, now what we're going to hear is that part 2 is going to be written out. So that occurs at measure 22, where it's marked piano on your score, that example. And that then does the same thing as far as the extension that occurs in 25 and 26. And then that leads to the final statement of the part 1 material at the odd tempo, and you'll hear it that it's embellished there on that final return. So here's a written out repeat of part 2. So there's part 3 embellished. Okay, so what I want you to do next is to go to the Homework tab and slide down to the Song Forms Homework. Click on that, and then you'll see that there are 5 pages here. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different examples of song form. And so these are one of these types that we've talked about just now. And these don't have 5-part song forms. But I want you to look at these and to indicate the parts and to indicate the phrase construction of each part. All right, so I'll have you look at that, and then we will talk about these coming up.